Chimo, just getting set up real quick. We're gonna put a link in the chat room. Couple of links in the chat room. And of course, if you have any issues with the sound, please let me know. And we're going to get started in a second. I just wanted to put this link in the chat room for you. Okay, so hold on one second. There's one more. Okay, so Yachimo, I'll say once again for joining in. So this is this sixth and final class for the BAITI-SENEB, Cosmology of Divine Twin Flame Marriage and so forth. So we wanted to get to Shu and Tefnut. Now we did in the beginning, of course, when we first defined BAITI, and of course Seneb means self, but BAITI is the dual T Ba spirit, which is the twin flame and so forth. And we talked about the Ba and the divine living energy and the bowl of burning incense and the whole notion of the flame and so forth. So we talked about that. We also talked about, Shu and Tefnut embodying the divine twin flame function. And we talked about them in the text of Ancient Kemet. So, but we want to get into some of the cosmology of Shu and Tefnut, where they're found on Earth, also within the body, and how that affects the spirit and their interaction with one another. When you see how they operate on Earth and within Earth, and then within the body, then that whole notion of these twin flame spirits, you get a better understanding of that. We are going to touch once again and refresh our memory on the cosmology as it's laid out in the Runu Pertinent Heru with regard to Shu and Tefnut. But first, we want to get into this notion of cosmology, where they're seated. Their shrines are seated physiologically. Physiologically, but geologically on Earth, and then we'll have a better understanding. So first and foremost, let's go to our book, Afuraitkiatnut, The Origin of the Term Africa. And this is page 25. So this is our book, Afuraitkiatnut, The Origin of the Term Africa. And in section 3, in part 3, which is on page 25, there's a section we want to address. So we're talking about the divinity, Ptah, who fashions all of creation. And we actually talked about Ptah last week. And we were talking about Ptah being the divine force in creation, operating through the innermost core of the Aten stars and planets, including the innermost core of Asase of Earth. Ptah is called the great fashioner, creator, maker, excavator of the universe. So we talked about Ptah last week, fashioning spirit bodies and thought forms and so forth. So, operating through the innermost solar energetic core of Asase, Earth fashions the life force energy. This is what Ptah does, streaming in from the Aten, the sun, and through Asase, Earth, into forms that are capable of shaping the surface and inner structure of Asase. So that workshop, when they talk about Ptah being the master craftsman, and he's in his workshop, and he's the divinity that's the governor and patron divinity of craftsmen. And you see Ptah standing here, and of course that is as we said before, this the origin of the Oscar statue. Oscar award winners have this golden statue of Ptah because they're artisans and they master their craft and they're master craftsmen and craftswomen, and they supposedly, and they're creating quote unquote art, works of art and so forth. This is where they get the statue from. But the cosmology is he's deep within the core, within his workshop. His workshop is the inner core of Earth, and he's constantly fashioning, forming, like a potter on a potter's wheel and so forth, constantly fashioning and forming, expansive and contractive, those thermodynamics operating within the core of Earth that are shaping the surface of the planet constantly and reshaping and refiguring and configuring. Ptah is deep within the core, and Sekhmet, the female divinity Sekhmet, counterpart of Ptah, is deep within the core as well. So, so this is what we're saying here. Now, hold on one second. So it says his divine workshop is at the center of Asase through the molten iron in Asase's core, approximated to be 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Ptah works to fashion forms, just as your brain, as we talked about last week, takes the living energy moving through you and fashions it into thought forms. He takes the living energy coming in from the Aten, the sun, and other stars, and fashions it into forms and so forth. Now, and we talked about who he is, you know, Obuade and Akan, and Obaluaye in Yoruba, and Sakpata in Vodun, and so forth. Now, when they talk about the lineage, the divine dynasties of ancient Kemet, and they talk about the deities first being in rulership, and then later on, men and women, you know, kings and queens, first the divinities, then the venerable ancestresses and ancestors, then you have the reign of the human kings and queen mothers and so forth. But they first talk about the divine dynasties. You'll see that in the so-called Turin papyrus and so forth. The divine dynasties, the rule of the deities first, beginning with Ptah, the first king of Earth. This is why in Akan, Obuade is the fashioner of Earth and so forth. In Yoruba, Obaluaye or Babaluaye and so forth is the first king, Oba of Aye, Earth. Da Zoji or Sakpata and Vodun is the first king of Earth and so forth, the same divinity. Because Ptah is first king and fashioner of the divine black substance of the primordial earth into the first raised land, he has the title Ka. It is Ptah's two arms that receive the Ba, the spirit of Ra, of the newly created planet Earth. Initially, as the primordial Earth's surface began to take shape and cool, the kingship of Earth passed from the molten iron and solar core through the mantle, the crust, and eventually to the soil surface. Thus, the texts of Kemet speak of the kingship of Earth eventually being passed down from Ptah, which is the inner core, to Heru, outer core, to Atem, the lower mantle, Shu, the upper mantle, Geb, the crust, and to Asar, the black soil substance of Earth, to Herus, the solar energy moving from the outer core of the various levels being birthed throughout into the world throughout plant life and so forth. So we're talking about the kingship when they talk about the deities, the rule of the deities. You're talking about Ptah, you know, ruling, and then the Shabaka text, they talk about Atem following Ptah and so forth, and then Atem, the father of Shu, and then the Shu is the father of Geb, and Geb is the father of Asar, and Asar is the father of Heru and so forth. You're talking about the inner core, lower mantle, upper mantle, crust, and then black soil substance on every level. So let's look at an image of that real quick. Hold on one second, let me make sure. All right, so let's look at this image. Okay, so the earth layer by layer, you have the inner core and the core, the mantle, the crust, and First of all, when we look at Geb and Nut, just so you can see that, so when we talk about Geb and Nut, and you see Geb here on the ground, the earth divinity, and then you have Nut, the stars in the sky, and of course what you're seeing is the crust of the earth, and then at nighttime when you see the the sky, the canopy of the sky full of stars and so forth, and it's basically hugging the earth. Geb is the earth's crust, and then you have Nut laying, surrounding him. That's the atmosphere surrounding earth. And then in the daytime, you see Shu, the fiery energy of Shu, separating or pushing the blackness up. And at the early dawn, you see that blackness begin to rise up, meaning Nut, the mother, and Geb, the father, begin to separate. And then you see the light of the day and so forth. There's an expansion, but then at nighttime, Nut, the darkness of the sky, the atmosphere, and Geb unite and hug once again. So what you're looking at here in these different representations, Geb laying on the ground and so forth, and Nut bent over with the stars in her body. She is the atmosphere surrounding the planet, but we're talking about the Earth's crust. That's Geb. The planet itself as an ovum within the great, womb of the great mother Amenet. On the fertile side is Asase Afua. The barren side is Asase, the twin female earth divinity, earth mother divinities. But the crust portion, that's the Geb proportion. So when people make a mistake and say, well, Geb is the earth father in ancient Kemet, they add a male earth deity, but in other cultures on the continent, the earth is the earth mother. That's because people don't understand the differences. So we're going to go into these differences, the proper differences. Okay, so now we get back to so the entire planet itself is Asase Afur, the fertile earth mother, Asase Ya, the barren aspects of the earth mother and so forth. But now we're going to get into the layers. So when we talk about the inner core, we're dealing with Ptah as well as Sekhmet. They're fashioning the fire in the inner core. Ptah was the first king of earth, according to the Divine Dynasties. So you're dealing with the inner core here. Solid metal ball, has a radius of 758 miles, and they talk about that. Then you have the outer core. Heru is connected to the outer core. Now you deal with the mantle, and there's the upper mantle and the lower mantle. Now, it says that at close to 3,000 kilometers thick, this is Earth's thickest layer. It starts a mere 30 kilometers beneath the surface. Made mostly of iron, magnesium, and silicon. Silicon, it is dense, hot, and semi-solid. Semi-solid. Link the layer below it. Hold on one second. Okay, like the layer below it, this one also circulates. It does so far more slowly, talking about molten rock.
The ones that are nonsensical.
Okay, make sure your mic is muted. All right. So,
get water. Get a cup.
Make sure your mic is muted, because your mic keeps going on. All right. So, so then it says nearest upper edges, lower, somewhere between 100 and 200 kilometers underground, the mantle's temperature reaches the melting point of rock. We're talking about molten rock. Indeed, forms a layer of partially melted rock known as the asthenosphere. Geologists believe this weak, hot, slippery part of the mantle is what Earth's tectonic plates ride upon and slide across. Now, we just want to go back real quick. Okay, so to the Afuraitkiatnut document. So we talked about Bataz, the inner core, Heru, outer core, Atem is the lower mantle, but then you also have the upper mantle. You have Geb, the crust, Alsar, the black soil substance. So when you're talking about the mantle, lower mantle is to talk about the rock, but then the upper mantle, the molten rock and so forth, asthenosphere. What are we dealing with when we're talking about Shu and the asthenosphere? First, we want to look at this. We're going to look at the name of the divinity. And it gives insight into the nature of the divinity. So we have Shu and Tefnut here. You see the feather of Shu. You see the sun disk on the head of Tefnut. She's in the form of a lioness, fiery animal, and so forth. Shu can mean air, talking about expansion, the expansion in the air, and you see the feather, but then you also see the circle with the dot in the middle, that is the solar disk. So that's the fanning of the flames of the fire. That's why Shu also means fire, heat, Shu, light, the sun, daylight. And you see the feather once again, you see the solar disk with the sun rays and so forth. That is the fanning of the flames of the fire. So that expansive aspect of air with the fire in the air and so forth, the fire itself, that is Shu. That's in the Meduta. So his name is made up of that. In Akan, Shu or shell or Shu means burning, heat, hot, very warm, hot, fiery, fierce, wild, vehement, ardent, very active, and so forth. So Shu in Akan, that HY is pronounced the Shu sound, the Shet sound. So Shu means fiery, hot, burning heat, just like Shu in ancient Khanid and Kemet means fiery, burning heat, and so forth. You'll see in ancient Khanid and Kemet, Tefin means to spit, to pour out. That's the root of Tefnut and so forth. You'll see the release here. We're talking about that release of fiery energy and water and so forth. Tefin, and also the term Tef, reduplicated. Tef means to spit or expectorate and so forth, to release not only sound vibrations and energy, but it can also mean water and so forth, and venom for a snake, for example, hot fiery venom, a fire spitting cobra, that spittle to release. Tefin, the root of the name Tefnut, meaning that, the same thing. In Akan, Ntafi means spittle or to spit, Ntafi and so forth. So Tafi meaning to spit or to release. Tefin means to spit or release in ancient Khanid and Kemet, the name of these two divinities. So there's a fiery force in the mantle, expansive and contractive. The Tefnut, the spittle and so forth, having to do with water, expansion, fiery, with Shu and so forth. So there's an expansive, fiery, watery force within the mantle. And this is deep within the core. And then we're going to show deep within the body, we have something very similar, the shrines of Shu and Tefnut in the body as twins, these twin flame, fiery energy divinities. So if you're talking about, very often you'll hear about Tefnut governing water and Shu governing fire, and there's an expansion and contraction, just like the so-called yin and yang and so forth, is where they get the Shu and Tefnut, yin and yang from, Shu and Tefnut and so forth. But there's a fiery water. But when we think about water, we think about coolness typically. So what is this notion of a water, meaning Tefnut, fire, water. And if you look at her name, it's spittle. You see the wavy, watery line being released. Taf, meaning that, but then Nut, this is a vessel, the Nut vessel that contains water and so forth. So there's a Tef, a spit, a release of fluid into a vessel, but then Tefnut also has the solar disk on her head. So it must be a fiery fluid, but there's a fiery fluid within the mantle. If we're talking about Shu and Tefnut within the mantle, in the upper mantle. And then Shu, of course, the fiery energy and so forth, but there's fiery energy, it should be in the mantle. So let's look at what we're talking about and see what geology has to say about it. Now, this link is in the chat room. I want to make sure you can see that link. Okay, so this link is in the chat room. So it says, found hidden ocean locked up deep in Earth's mantle. June 12th, so-called 2014, 13,014. So this is important because this, once again, is some of the information that we bring forward, we brought forward with regard to Shu and Tefnut a number of years ago. The book Afuraitkiatnut, The Origin of the Term Africa, was written, published in 13,007, so-called 2007, 7 years before this article was published. We're talking about Shu, and then, which includes Tefnut, Shu and Tefnut together in the lower mantle. Now, deep within the Earth's rocky mantle lies oceans worth of water locked up in a type of mineral called ringwoodite, new research shows. The results of the study will help scientists understand Earth's water cycle and how plate tectonics moves water between the surface of the planet and interior reservoirs, researchers say. The Earth's mantle is the hot, rocky layer between the planet's core and crust. We just said Shu means fire and heat, and he's in the lower mantle. The Earth's mantle is the hot, rocky layer between the Earth's core, Ptah, and then the Earth's crust, which is Geb. So the core is Ptah, then you have the mantle, which is Atem, lower mantle, Atem, upper mantle, Shu, and then the upper crust, the crust is Geb. Between the core and the crust, between Ptah and Geb, as we said, is Shu. That's in their lineage. That's how they manifest as kings in ancient Kemet, first Ptah, and then Atem, and then Shu, and then Geb, and then Asar, generation after generation and so forth. They're here in the different layers. So it's a fiery energy in the hot, rocky layer between the planet's core and crust. Scientists have long suspected that the mantle's so-called transition zone, which sits between the upper and lower mantle layers, 255 to 410 miles below Earth's surface, could contain water trapped in rare minerals. However, direct evidence for this water has been lacking until now. That was written in 13,014, 2014. They just found evidence of water within the Earth's mantle. Oceans worth of water locked up in the Earth's mantle, in the hot, fiery aspect of the inner Earth. Our cosmology is saying that Tefnut, with her fiery disk, and she's the one that spits and releases that water in that container, that Nut vessel, that Tefnut, that release of water, Tef, within the vessel, within the form, the Nut. It's not just cool water, but fiery, hot water within the mantle. Our cosmology says Shu and Tefnut exist within the mantle, and it describes their characteristics as the fiery energy and the hot, watery energy within the mantle. They're just discovering that, but our cosmology has woven that into our culture for thousands of years. Now, they say to see if the transition zone is really is a deep reservoir for water. Researchers conducted experiments on water-rich ringwoodite, analyzed seismic waves traveling through the mantle between the United States and studied numerical models. They discovered that downward flowing mantle material is melting as it crosses the boundary between the transition zone and the lower mantle layer. If we're seeing this melting, then there has to be this water in the transition zone. Said one of the seismologists, the transition zone can hold a lot of water and could potentially have the same amount of H2O as all of the world's oceans. Melting is a way of getting rid of water, which is unstable under conditions in Earth's lower mantle, the researchers said. So then they talk about the ringwoodite, a water-rich mineral and all of that. But the key is they just discovered an ocean's worth of water in the lower mantle. Tefnut, the divinity that has the water as part of her hieroglyph, her medut, contained within a vessel nut. So it's the Tef. Just to go back so you can see that once again, our people are defining what is in the, so you see Tefnut here. And you see Tefn to spit out the release of water. You see here once again the release of the wavy, watery line, and it's captured in the nut vessel, Tefnut. So it's the water that's released, held within a vessel in a structure. In this case, that vessel is the lower mantle. But what kind of water is it? You see the solar disk, the circle with the dot in the middle. She's the daughter of Ra and so forth. And because she's the daughter of Ra, who operates through the solar disk, she has a solar disk on her head. It is surmounted by a cobra, a serpent, fire-spitting cobra. So we're talking about a hot, fiery water within a container, the nut, which is Shu and Tefnut, within the lower mantle. So that's within the physical Earth. That our cosmology corroborates that. And this is one of those things that we put forward just to let people know that our people have studied this information. We laid this information out in our cosmology thousands of years ago, and the whites and our offspring are just catching up to that. Now, we also want to look at this notion of make sure you can see this. Okay, so you also see this notion of hot springs. So this is what you call a hot spring. And once again, we typically think about water, we think about something cool, warm or cool, and so forth. We need to understand when we're dealing with this cosmology, because it deals directly with the expansive and contractive force of these twin divinities who work in harmony with one another, expansion and contraction, fire and water, balancing each other out as Afurakanu man, Afuraitkiatnut woman, as twin flame spirits. So the hot spring is a spring produced by the emergence of geothermally heated groundwater that arises from the Earth's crust. While some of these springs contain water that is a safe temperature for bathing, others are so hot that immersion can result in an injury or death. So you can get, this one is Yellowstone National Park. It's, you know, a hot spring. Now there are different definitions. Any geothermal spring, a spring with water temperatures above its surroundings. They have a number of different, you know, pieces for that. And just so you can see a couple of more images. So in some of them, they're warm enough, they're hot, but you can still get in them, but some of them will scald you. It can lead to death. You see some people getting inside of, you know, hot springs, but then on other ones you can't. And these have been known. They're in one of our images for our show, we show, you know, a hot spring in the desert in ancient Khanid and Kemet that still exists now. Okay, so let me make sure you can see that. Okay, so the sources of the heat, they talk about created by the decay of naturally radioactive elements. And they talk about different things. We don't have to go through all of that. Water issuing from a hot spring is heated geothermally, that is with heat produced from the geothermally, deep within the core, that fire within the core of Earth and so forth. that arises from the core. So the water that issues from the hot spring is heated geothermally, that is, with heat produced from the Earth's mantle. In general, the temperature of rocks within the Earth increases with depth. The rate of temperature increase with depth is known as the geothermal gradient. If water percolates deeply enough into the crust, it will be heated as it comes into contact with hot rocks. The water from hot springs and non-volcanic areas is heated in this manner. So once again, even the water that comes up from the surface, not regular ocean water, but the water that arises from the Earth's surface is coming, that hot water is coming from the Earth's mantle. That is the hot water of Tefnut spewing forth. That is the Tef, the expectorant, the spittle, the release, the Tef. And even if you say Tef, you're quote unquote spitting and so forth, coming from the newt, Tefnut coming from the vessel, the mantle. That water is rising to the top, and it's a boiling water, it's a fiery water, and so forth. So that's the origin geologically. Now, let's look at where their shrines. That's their shrines on Earth. What are their shrines within the body? So remember, of course, they are twins. Talking about twin flames, fiery energy, and so forth. Now, the pleural cavity. We're talking about the lungs. When we talk about expansion and contraction, the feather of Shu and so forth, expansion and contraction, and sometimes Shu and Tefnut are called the two Shu or Shu T, as we mentioned in the previous piece. That feather dealing with the fanning of the flames and expansive energy. We're looking at the lungs as the seat of the expansion and contraction, Shu and Tefnut, and even the Shu dealing with that release of fiery air and so forth, the sh sound, the Shu sound, the fiery sound, and so forth. But the pleural cavity, also known as the pleural space, is the thin fluid-filled space between the two pulmonary pleurae, known as visceral and parietal, of each lung. So there's a space in between. The pleura is a serous membrane which folds back onto itself to form a two-layered membranous pleural sac. The outer pleura is attached to the chest wall, but is separated from it by the endothoracic fascia. The inner pleura covers the lungs and adjoining structures, including the blood vessels, bronchi, and nerves. The pleural cavity can be viewed as a potential space because the two pleurae adhere to each other through the thin film of serous fluid under all normal conditions. So if you're looking at this, look at a larger picture of it. So you have the lung tissue, and you have a pleural cavity, and it's full of water. So the lungs expand and contract. There's a cavity in between, and there's water in between, and then, you know, that is connected to the rib cage and so forth, and then also connected to the internal organs and so forth. But you have the fiery energy, fire expansion and contraction when you're breathing and generating heat, arousal, fire, and so forth. Shu and Tefnut, Shu, Tefnut, expansion and contraction within the lungs. But then there's a fluid-filled area, the pleural cavity, that has the pleural fluid that's deep within the expansive and contractive force within the lungs. That is directly related. That's the shrine and the space of Shu and Tefnut within the body, just like deep within the core of Earth. You have the lower mantle, but then within that mantle and near the transition zone, there's an ocean's worth of water. And that's that fiery water that eventually some of it percolates up, becomes hot springs on the surface of Earth and so forth. That is the water, the fiery energy, that fire of Shu and Tefnut within that molten rock and water. That's deep within the body and so forth. Now, the function of the pleural cavity with its associated pleurae aids optimal functioning of the lungs during breathing. Optimal function. You're not going to be able to expand and contract and breathe properly without the functioning of Shu and Tefnut properly. The pleural cavity also contains pleural fluid, which acts as a lubricant and allows the pleurae to slide effortlessly against each other during respiratory movements. Surface tension of the pleural fluid also leads to close apposition of the lung surfaces in the chest wall. This relationship allows for greater inflation of the alveoli during breathing. The pleural cavity transmits movements of the ribs, muscles to the lungs, particularly during heavy breathing and so forth. During inhalation, the external intercostals contract, as does the diaphragm. This causes the expansion of the chest wall that increases the volume of the lungs. A negative pressure and inhalation occurs. So even if we're looking at that, talking about the surface tension of the pleural fluid also leads to close apposition of the lung surfaces of the chest wall, allows the pleurae to slide effortlessly against each other during respiratory movements. Surface tension. So when we're talking about expansion and contraction, what happens, we talked about in a previous, in the Honam Su class, when we're talking about the lungs and so forth, in the medicine, in ancient Afuraitkiatnut medicine and so forth, and then the whites and their offspring, with, Taoism and, Chinese medicine and so forth, when they talk about grief is trapped in the lungs. So if you're grieving and so forth, that energetic force can be, caught up in the lungs, and then it causes problems in the lungs. If you don't release the grief and so forth, that can cause problems not only emotionally, but physically in the lung area. So there can be life force energy blocked up in the lung area because of grief. So we're talking about grief or sadness or, that melancholy and so forth. If you have that and it's in association with relationships, that blockage can cause problems within a relationship. But when you look that this is the shrine of Shu and Tefnut, when we're pouring libation and communicating with the divinities, and we invoke Shu and Tefnut every day, just like we invoke these different divinities, if we get into a space in our relationship where we, as Afurakanu man, Afuraitkiatnut woman, and there's tension and certain things happen, and then there's quote unquote sadness or grief over certain things that have taken place, or we believe certain obstacles have manifested that have caused problems, or the way we perceive things and so forth, and it gets trapped in this area. If you're constantly having these kind of depressed, feelings, then that leads to, fracturing within the relationship. When people feel like their needs are not being met, or something has, quote unquote, died within the relationship, then things cause, problems become, exacerbated, and eventually people, break up, separate, whatever it is. But this is the shrine of Shu and Tefnut. These are the lungs. So when grief is happening, sadness, melancholy, quote unquote, depression is happening and so forth, when we invoke the divinities, Shu and Tefnut, who would normally expand and contract the lungs fully and freely and wide open and so forth, so there's a free flow of life force energy and fire that can burn up impurities. When we invoke them, then we open up that area and we repel that tension that's gripping the lung area. So we can, release that depression, and we can see more clearly, and we can communicate better and so forth, and see if there are some temporary obstacles, what's the best way to overcome them. But if you're trapped in this melancholy, despair, depression, sadness, grief, and all of this, other stuff, and you don't know how to release that, then it, it controls your thoughts, it controls your behavior, it controls your reactions and so forth. It can even lead to that further constriction that leads to the kind of stress that can lead to physical disease. So dealing with the lung structure, invoking these divinities, and especially through ritual movement, because ritual movement, whether it's ritual dance or ritual, like for us, abo and kwa, moving up our bodies in the form of the animal totems, the achinebois and so forth. The whites and offspring would still talk about yoga and so forth. And of course, we have our book on the origin of the term yoga and so forth. But those ritual movements leading to the further expansion and contraction of the lungs and stimulating the Xuan and Shu and Tefnut. You begin to free some of that up. Even when people say they'll go on a run to clear their head, and they know instinctively that's what's happening. They either go work out or they go, go on a run to clear their head. They're not just clearing their head because they're thinking about other things. They're generating expansion and contraction within the lungs. When you engage in aerobic activity, you're forcing your lungs to expand and contract and break through these, blockages of energy. You're forcing yourself to do that because you have to take in greater volumes of air when you're running or engaged in, strenuous activity. And it's constant and aerobic and so forth, not just lifting weights, but, aerobic running, aerobic exercise, whatever it is, constant movement and so forth. You're constantly breathing in greater volumes of air, fire, heat, and you're stimulating the Xuan and Shu and Tefnut. When you're running, you're doing the same thing, and it's a constant movement of air. You begin to break up those blockages of energy, at least temporarily. And once your energy is free flowing, you're not trapped or constricted in that area. Now, of course, to sustain that, you need to attune to the divinities themselves. But even just on a basic level, engaging in movement, you begin to free some of that up. If somebody comes back from a run, they're more clear-headed. If their spouse went on a run or did something else strenuous and so forth, and they're more clear-headed, now you can have a better conversation. You've instinctively stimulated the shrines of the twin divinities Shu and Tefnut just by virtue of the fact that you're constantly expanding and contracting at a greater level, at an intense, and consistent level for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or however long you're engaged in that. Okay, so now we want to get into some of the cosmological aspect of it from the text of Kemet. And we're going to go to the Runu Pertnim Heru. Give me a second, just need to pull this up. Okay, so it is in chapter 17 of the Runu Pertnim Heru. Let me see, okay. So it should be right around page 44 in the Budge's edition, Dover edition. Okay. Okay, so there's a section here we want to go back to just to give it proper context. We're not going to go through the whole chapter because that's one of the most extensive chapters in the Runu Pertnim Heru and so forth. So we do need to have a little bit of context. So we're going to go through okay, let me just make sure we don't want to go too far back. All right. Okay, we don't have to go back that far. Okay, we're going to start on page 38. So here they're talking about the four sons of Heru who govern the visceral organs that almost stay governs the liver, Hop governs the lungs in general, the lung structure. Dwamutef governs the stomach, and Keb-Senewef govern the intestines. So those are the four sons of Heru and so forth. And you see the canopic jars in ancient Khanate Kemet, and those organs are placed in those jars and so forth. So when they say almost stay hot, Dwamutef and Keb-Senewef, these are the four sons of Heru. Homage to you, masters of Ma'at, truth and so forth, divine beings behind Asar, causing to be annihilated defects or disorder, esfet, who are in the following of Hetep Sekus. So the four sons of Heru, the divinities that govern the major organs, they destroy defects, just like your organs, your liver and your intestines and your lungs and your stomach and so forth, digestive system take in nutrients. The lungs take in air and so forth. It can also take in pollutants, but the fire in the lungs burns up impurities, and the liver detoxifies the blood and so forth. And you have the stomach that takes in the nutrients, but also has the gastric acid that kills bacteria and so forth. And you have the intestines that release nutrients into the bloodstream, but also take the waste and move it through the body and move it out of the body. So on an organal level, of course, they destroy defects. These masters of Ma'at, right and truth, divine beings who are behind Al-Sar, supporting Al-Sar, causing to be annihilated defects. But as shrines within the body, their energetic forces also destroy energetic defects within your system. They are in the following of Hetep Sekus, which is a divinity. So it says, grant you me that I may come to you, destroy you defects all which belong to me, just like they destroy the defects in the body of Asar, make it pure. The individual is asking, since I've transitioned, I'm going to the ancestral realm, I want to be accorded the same, assistance that Asar was accorded. Destroy the defects for me because I lived in harmony with order, so I'm in a position to receive that assistance from you. Please destroy the defects, just like you have your organs. You direct your organs hormonally, destroy the bacteria that's manifesting, directing the liver, detoxify the blood, directing the lungs, burn up impurities, directing the stomach, kill the bacteria and parasites with the gastric acid. The intestines, get rid of the waste. You're, unconsciously directing your organs to destroy defects within you. Spiritually, those organs destroy the spiritual negative projections of individuals and entities who would try to, control you, just like parasites try to latch onto you, but your immune system destroys them. Spiritually, discarnate spirits of relatives, non-relatives, will try to attach themselves, but these divinities, their forces through your these major organs repel. So destroy the defects which belong to me according to that which you wrought for the 7 Aku, the illuminated beings who are among the followers of their master Sepa. Anpu made their place on the day that are therefore there. So when we talked about this before, there are 7 deities who are the followers of Sepa, who's the centipede divinity. When you look in the rib structure and the 43 sets of nerves and so forth, and then you see that centipede divinity, it's the 43 sets of nerves. And just so we can see that real quick, hold on one second. All right. Just so you can see what we're talking about here. When you see this was from our broadcast on the deity Sepa, the 42 nomes of Kemet, the 42, basically administrative divisions or states in the country of Kemet. Each had its own capital, plus the capital of the country makes it 43. but you have 43 sets of nerves in the body that regulate your entire nation. Those 42 sets of nerves, pairs of nerves, regulate your nation, all the organs within your nation. They're connected to all the organs. Sepa is the centipede divinity, and the centipede is sitting right inside of the body, regulating all of the different 43 sets of nerves, the 42 sets plus the capital and so forth, just like Kemet is divided up into 42 gnomes, plus the capital makes 43. The centipede divinity is regulating the entire body of the country. The 43 sets of nerves are regulating the entire body of the individual and all the organs. And then we're talking about this deity Sepa regulating 42 plus 3, plus 1, 43 divinities and so forth, governing the spirit body. So there's a force governing the physical body, literally 43 sets of nerves. The country was divided up into 42 gnomes, plus the capital makes that 43. And then spiritually, that divinity does the same thing. So this is what the text is actually talking about. When they're talking about the Lord Sepa, or the deity Sepa, had 7 deities that were among his followers. Anpu placed them to govern the body of Alsar. 7, they say beatified, Aku, venerable spirits, illuminated spirits. Aku means to shine, illuminate, and so forth. The 7 illuminated spirits that govern the mummified body of Alsar that Anpu placed over them. And Sepa was their leader and so forth. There are 7 illuminated forces that govern the body of the divinity, the purified body. These are the 7 deities that govern the 7 quote-unquote chakras that govern the purified spirit body. This is what they're talking about in this text. So we went over that a little bit in the first class. So these masters of Ma'at, Tuhuti, Ar, Nastes, and Lord of Amentet, divine beings behind Alsar, is Amoste, Hapi, Dwamutef, Kepsenwef, behind the thigh in the northern heaven. They're talking about that as well. But those who cause the annihilation of defects are in the following: Hetep, Sekus, Sebek are in the waters. And they talk about Hetep, Sekus is the eye of Ra and so forth. But this is the piece we want to get to. Given the different names of the 7 beings that govern the spirit body of Alsar. And we have these 7 shrines that govern our spirit bodies as well. And we govern that in our book, on the origin of the term, Yoga Karakasa, the origin and nature of the chakras. So, but here's the piece that we wanted to get to. Now, the chief of the divine beings of those of this hall is Heru, the avenger of his father. As concerning the day that have come then there, the saying to Alsar it is by Ra, come then there. See, decreed it is it for me in Amentet. I am his Ba, his spirit, Herab within the 2 Chafi. What then is it? Is Alsar, when he goes to Jed Jedu, you see the Jed pillar, and finds the Ba of Ra there. They embrace one another in the Jed pillar. We talked about the Jed pillar being the backbone and so forth. The spirit of Ra and the spirit of Alsar embrace one another in the Jed pillar, that expansive and contractive force. Coming to existence, the Bayu, the spirits within the 2 Chafi, or the twin Chafi. This is where we were talking about the Baiti term in the first class. But it says his Ba within the twin Chafi is the Ba this of Ra, the Ba this of Alsar, the Ba this which is within Shu, the Ba this which is within Tefnut, the double Ba this which is within Jejedu, or the region of the Jed pillar and so forth. So it's the Ba, the dual Ba, the dual spirit that's within the Jed pillar, going up the Jed pillar and so forth, is the Ba of Shu and the Ba of Tefnut. And that's that fiery energy that will move up the Jed pillar, but it is fired up by the expansion and the contraction of the lungs. Now let's look at some information about Shu in the cosmology. Now it says the most important myth concerning Shu and Tefnut is, however, that in which Tefnut, the eye of Ra, the fierce protector of Ra and enforcer of his will in the cosmos, is pacified or cooled by Shu, as is clearly alluded to in the coffin text spell 75, where Shu says, I have extinguished the fire, I have calmed the soul of her who burns, actually the Ba, the spirit of her who burns, I have quieted her who is in the midst of her rage. Shu says, talking about there was a conflict between Shu and Tefnut. And Tefnut actually left this whole story of the distant goddess. Tefnut left and she went south into Kanit, into Nubia. And she took all the water with her. And the whole country was suffering and so forth. And then Ra directed Shu to go and retrieve Tefnut, and Tahuti went along with them. And they eventually convinced Tefnut to return and come back to Kemet, and all the water was brought back, and then there was balance in the land. Now, but when it says Shu has, I have extinguished the fire, I have calmed the soul of her who burns, I have quieted her who is in the midst of her rage. Shu also says, I am he whom the flame of fire burns, but its fiery blast is not against me, which at once refers to air as the medium and sustenance of fire, but also has a deeper significance for the deceased empowered by his or her identification with Shu. Says later in the same spell, there is no flame for my Ba, not my soul, but my spirit, on account of its foulness. That is there. So let's cover that whole piece for it, because it has to do with our relationships. So if Shu and Tefnut, Shu, fire, Tefnut, the fiery water, the boiling over water that can actually be warm water. When people get in a hot spring, you can get in those hot springs and they have minerals within that, natural hot springs. And that mineral water, in those natural hot springs is healing. Some of that water you get into the water, people have different ailments like arthritis or other diseases and so forth. They get in those hot springs and the water actually heals them. And those places are sacred and they're known for that. So you have Shu, which is the fire. You have Tefnut, which is that fiery water and so forth. Now, we can be in relationships and they deal with expansion and contraction within the lungs. We're dependent on their expansion and contraction to be fired up. When you start taking a lot of air and you get fired up because you're ready to do something, Shu and Tefnut, expansion and contraction. In the lungs, the pleural cavity, the water within the lungs and so forth. So you have the air, you have fire, you have water, just like the fire and water deep within the core of Earth. That's the whole Earth is dependent on those thermodynamics within the core and the lower mantle and upper mantle and so forth. So our existence is dependent on that. Our capacity to move and function and operate and be fired up enough to go, execute our function in the world, engage in work and activities and nation building, everything else is dependent on the expansion and contraction of Shu and Tefnut's fire. But fire can stimulate, fire can heat up, it can fire you up, it can stimulate, it can, do everything you need to do, vitalize you and so forth, but fire can also burn and scald and you can die from it. Boiling water can burn you to death, rip the skin off your body and everything else. Now, I said the eye of Ra, the fierce protector of Ra and enforcer of his will in the cosmos. He says, I have extinguished the fire. I have calmed the spirit of her who burns. I have quieted her who is in the midst of her rage. So when Tefnut goes off and there's a separation, what is the means by which we bring some balance? Is this notion of fighting fire with fire? That doesn't work out. The cosmology shows you what we need to do. Shu, even though he's a divinity of fire, he says, I have cooled. He says, I have extinguished the fire. I have calmed the spirit of her who burns. Hold on, let me plug this in right quick. Okay, I had to plug in right quick. So I have extinguished the fire. I have calmed the spirit of her who burns. So one of the ways to cool down the fire is with water immediately, as opposed to more fire trying to burn down or fight fire with fire and so forth. That's not going to lead to a harmonious, resolution. It says, I have quieted her, meaning calmed her who was in the midst of her rage. Shu, when he went to Khanit or Nubia to go bring Tefnut back, he went along with Tahuti. Ra directed Tahuti to go along with Shu to go retrieve Tefnut. Let's see an image of that real quick so you can see what it looks like. This is one of those images. And you'll see Tefnut in the form of the lioness. And they had Shu in the form of a baboon and so forth, but sometimes Tahuti would take the form of a baboon as well, but he went to go retrieve her and so forth. And that's actually a better image of that. Now, to go back to that piece, hold on 1 second. Okay, so when Shu was sent to go retrieve Tefnut because the whole world was suffering because that water was taken away. So people were suffering, lack of water, no nourishment, no healing, no vitalizing water and so forth. When there's a separation between the Afurakanu man, Afurakanu woman, husband and wife and so forth, there's no nourishment, there's no balance, there's no complementarity and so forth. The people within the household, the nation, the children, the miniature nation is suffering. So Ra, the creator of the universe, is number one going to direct Shu to go retrieve Tefnut. But he's not going to send Shu to go retrieve Tefnut and drag her back to Kemet saying, listen, it's your function to provide this water in the mantle of earth and so forth. The nation is suffering. You need to come back. And he didn't send her to order her to come back. He sent her to persuade her to come back. That means she's a lioness. She didn't submit to Shu. This is not Islam, some stupidity of Islam or Christianity, some nonsense about, the Black woman needs to submit to the man and so forth. There's a balance. There's a lion and lioness, a jata bere, as called in Akan, the lion and lioness, they balance one another out. The male is not submitting to the female is not in submission to the male. That's white slave talk. So when you hear these fools talking about the woman should be submitting to the man and why are we not talking about submission and what does it mean to submit and all that stupidity, that has to do with white nonsense. Ra did not send Shu to drag Tefnut and direct her or order her to come back to Kemet. He sent Shu to convince her or persuade her to come back to Kemet, and he directed Tahuti, the divinity of divine wisdom and divination, to accompany Shu to assist him in persuading the fiery goddess to come back. And through speech and persuasion and so forth, they talked it out and persuaded her to come back. Divine wisdom directed their speech so that she would return and bring that divine energy back. And then there was a balance brought back to the land. That's the cosmological approach to these issues of separation and return. It's not imitating the whites and their offspring. This is a cosmological approach going back thousands of years. So in the coffin text, when it says, I have extinguished the fire, I have calmed the spirit of her who burns, and extinguish meaning lowering it down, going from that scalding fire to that warm, powerful, vitalizing, fiery water, as opposed to the water that scalds, burns, and kills. I am he whom the flame of fire burns. He calmed the spirit of her who burns. I have quieted or calmed her who is in the midst of her rage. Then when she calms down, then she can see the bigger picture and so forth. And on the flip side, with her as well, she's not going to try to drag or command Shu to do what needs to be done. They're going to engage in a divinely wise, directed, wisdom-directed conversation, expression, persuasion. Then it says, Shu also says, I am he whom the flame of fire burns. So he is a fiery divinity, but his fiery blast is not against me. He's a divinity of fire, but he's not being burned alive. He has the capacity to emit this fire, but he's not burned up by it because he knows what to do with the fire in balance. An Afurakanu man has fiery energy, just like a lion and so forth, a jata, but he doesn't allow it to consume him. It says, but his fiery blast is not against me. I use the fire to destroy the enemy. I use the fire to fire up our community and so forth and engage the nation building process and put all that energy into nation building and defense. But it doesn't consume me. It doesn't burn me alive. The fire is vitalizing, keeps everything alive and powerful and vibrant. Then it says, Shu later says later in the text, there is no flame for my spirit on account of its foulness. There's a flame for the spirit if the spirit is foul, if it's adjudicated to be out of harmony with divine order, out of harmony with Ma'a and Ma'at, then the flame burns and, destroys. But because there's foulness. But if there's no foulness, when he says, there is no flame for my spirit on account of his foulness, that means when he goes, to be judged by the assessors of Ma'at and so forth, by the company of the divinities or the, tribunal of the deities and so forth, there's no flame that's going to burn up his energy because he's not doing anything foul. So in order for you to avoid, number one, when he says the fiery blast that is not against me, to avoid that, how do you avoid there is no flame for my spirit on account of his foulness, but there is a flame for the spirits of individuals who are foul, meaning disorder. A stench comes from their spirit because they're operating inside of Isfet. How do you avoid that? You have to maintain what they talked about earlier. We talked about the Neb Ma'at or Nebu Ma'at, the masters of Ma'at, the masters of law when we were reading from the text. You have to maintain sacred character, Subain Pa, good character. When you maintain sacred character, Subain Pa, and you're a Nebu Ma'at or master of Ma'at and so forth, then you're not going to emit any disordered energy or quote unquote foulness. There's no stench that's going to come from your spirit. So the flame from these fiery divinities that destroy disorder will not destroy you. The only fire that you have will be the kind of fire that's regenerative, protective, destructive of disorder, the kind of fire that can warm and build and defend what you're building. But if you're controlled by, bad character, then that fire will burn you up. Then you get into the position where it says, I am he whom the flame of fire burns, but his fiery blast is not against me. The fiery blast will be against you if you consume with disorder, if you consume with lust, if you consume with malice. Fire to destroy disorder is divine. Fire that becomes internalized and consuming because you're engaged in lust or malice, which is the corruption of love and hate. So you have divine law, love, and divine hate, the expansive and contracted poles of divine order. Divine law or love is the expansive pole of order. Divine hate is the contracted pole of divine order. Through divine law or love, we express order. Through divine hate, we impress order, or imprint or impress upon creation the parameters within which things must operate, and destroy anything that tries to operate outside those parameters. So we incorporate things, objects, deeds, and entities we need to incorporate in order to align our thoughts, intentions, and actions with divine order. We do that through law. We learn the laws that govern things. We incorporate that so we can live in harmony with divine order. And then we reject or hate or repel those things, objects, deeds, and entities we need to repel in order to, restore order to our existence and remove disorder from us. Just like you incorporate or you breathe in air, you breathe out carbon dioxide. You take in food for nutrients and power and so forth, but you eliminate waste. You incorporate and you reject. You take things in, utilize that for your best benefit to maintain order, and you reject the toxins that would otherwise, or the waste that would otherwise create disorder within you. If you have good character, then you're maintaining that balance. Then there's no foulness. But if you engage in disorder, if you engage in the corruption of divine law or love, that's lust. If you engage in the corruption of divine hate, that's malice. So if you're controlled by lust and malice, that's when the fire that's normally regenerative, bringing light and power to yourself and your wife, husband, children, community, begins to burn you alive because you're controlled by disorder, lust, and or malice. Then there's a foulness. Then the fire from the other divinities that are protective divinities can, burn you up and so forth. Then that fiery blast, the flame of the fire burns. It will, it'll blast against you and so forth. So the way we maintain balance, first and foremost, Shu and Tefnut, they're that vital energy that's behind our nation building process. There's no movement, no action, no anything happening without Shu and Tefnut. Just like the increase of expansion and contraction within the lungs, when you need to generate fiery energy to execute your function in the world, you're calling on Shu and Tefnut at that point. You're invoking them. We need to build this school. We need to build this business. We need to defend our community. We need to do whatever we need to do. You summon that expansive and contractive fire, and that includes fire within water and so forth. You're invoking Shu and Tefnut in balance. If you have negative character, you're bringing all that extra fiery energy in, and it's plugged into negative character and so forth. Shu and Tefnut are not participating on a conscious level. Now you're just taking the residual energy of fire and water and so forth and using it in a negative fashion. They're not participating in that. Then you plug that extra energy into lust and malice and increase disorder within yourself, physically, individually, and within your family. But if you live in harmony with order, you have good character, you take that fiery energy of Shu and Tefnut and you utilize it to heal yourself, to empower your spouse, empower your children, empower the community. If you have, and that's what that energy is for. Shu and Tefnut, the lower and mantle, that's a structural component of Earth. Is right on top of that is the crust. And the crust has the black soil as well as the red soil on top of it and so forth, and the river waters and everything else. So that's foundational. Without Shu and Tefnut in the mantle, you don't have a foundation. So they're foundational for everything. They have that foundational fire energy for everything we're trying to do. So if you invoke them, live in harmony with them, then you have that vitalizing energy to do everything we need to do nation building wise. If you get out of harmony with them, then this is the problem. So how do you get back in harmony with the spouse and so forth? You attune to the energy of Shu and Tefnut and see how they resolve these kinds of issues. Shu persuades Tefnut in the same thing in the other direction, according to divine wisdom. First attuning to Ra, the creator of the universe, being directed by Ra, not directed by your lust. But when Ra says you need to do this, I'm the creator of the universe, you need to go in this direction, you need to reconnect with your balance, but you need to do so in alignment with divine wisdom and divination with Tahuti. So I'm going to assign Tahuti to go with you so you can engage that process. And then when you reach out to Tefnut, you're reaching out through divine wisdom to persuade her to return to balance, as opposed to trying to drag her back and make her to submit to your desires. And the same thing in the other direction, when Shu is separate and so forth, Tefnut, and she will utilize in that context Seshat, the female divinity of divine wisdom and balance, to persuade through good speech, sacred speech, where the balance actually is, so we can see that balance and return to balance. So that's following the model of the divinities. We look at how do they operate? How do the two lungs work together in the body? The pleural cavity holding that fluid and so forth, then the fire within the lungs and so forth, they work together in balance. How does the lower mantle affect the earth? You have the ocean's worth of water moving through that, molten rock and so forth. There's a balance of fire and water, and that leads to the, shape and structure and foundational structure of the surface of earth and so forth that we can all stand upon. If we're dealing with Shu and Tefnut, and we're nation building, and they're foundational like the lower mantle, we attune to them, these deities of divine order, then we're going to make decisions that are in harmony with order, and our nation building process is going to be, sound. But if we're not in harmony with them, we're going to use that fiery energy, whether it's that fiery, flame type energy or that fiery water and so forth, and we're going to burn ourselves up and scald ourselves and scald each other and get into disputes and so forth, and we're not going to be invoking the divinities of wisdom and so forth, and we're going to be trying to force, using the fire to force the mate into one direction instead of using wisdom to persuade and open up the eyes and so forth. So this is why we utilize the, the model of the divinities. Okay, so we have a couple of questions in the chat room, and of course you can post questions in the chat room if you have a question. It says those who don't eat meat in Africa, snails and mushrooms, are we allowed to eat snails and mushrooms? And it's the same thing with your when you look at your dietary practices and you listen to your own Ra, of course. Even when we talk about meat eating and so forth, we're not really engaged in a meat eating process. When you look at carnivores, they, a lion attacks a zebra and they eat the meat, or a hyena attacks a zebra or gazelle and they eat the flesh of the animal. We're not doing that. What we're doing is we're capturing the animal and we're draining the blood, and then we're putting fire to the, body of the animal and transforming the flesh of the animal back towards, the vegetable realm or mineral realm. If you're cooking the meat and you forget about it and you leave for a while and come back, the fire burns it so much that it becomes a hard, piece of carbon, burnt to a crisp, so to speak. You just transform the flesh of the animal, the same flesh that the animal was just using to walk around and move itself, from place to place. And you killed the animal and took the flesh of the animal and put it in the fire. It became burnt to a crisp, meaning it went back to its mineral state. But even if it didn't get so far back to the point where it's burnt to a hard crisp, but it was just under the fire for a while and became tender and so forth, and it gets, more and more dry and so forth, it gets closer and closer to a vegetable. And then if you keep burning it, it'll lose all its moisture and become hardened and get to a mineral. But you're taking it from an animal through the vegetable state to the mineral state, and somewhere in between you're consuming. So we're not, even if we're cooking, animal flesh, we're still moving it towards the vegetable and mineral kingdom. So, for us, we've moved away from meat eating and so forth, and we consume plant life, mineral life, and so forth, which is our natural state. We got into killing animals and so forth, and then cooking them and transforming them back into the vegetable mineral state. We got into that for a while, but there's a study that was done in ancient Khanate and Kemet, and we did, as a matter of fact, I'll give you the link for this. just so you can see this whole piece. Okay, on our OG.sim site, we have a article that we posted, and it was dealing with a specific angle. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but ancient Afuraitkiatnut African associations of divinity and purification with refraining from the pig as well as other animal flesh. So there's a story in the coffin text talking about why the pig is an abomination to Heru. Set took the form of a pig, a black pig, and so forth in the story, and shot Heru in the eye, and Heru's eye was taken out, but then it was later healed and so forth, and the pig became an abomination to Heru and so forth. But they're talking about that. And we also talked about how animal is killed, like in our Khan tradition, and the spirit of the animal can become angry. It's called a sasa spirit, or volatile spirit, and so forth, and ritual has to be done to cool the spirit so it doesn't attack and so forth. We're talking about cosmological reasons within the culture why we avoided, you know, animal flesh and so forth, and it has to do with the spirit of the animal and different things. But because some people say, well, you know, vegetarianism comes from the Hindus, and there's no basis in Africa for vegetarianism, which is silly. But you have some Afrocentric scholars saying that. But we showed the cosmological foundation is right there in the text, also talking about the text of the Ra and Rait, avoiding animal flesh or fish. In fact, let's go back to that real quick just so you can see that particular link. Chapter 30b, Pert Imheru. Make sure you can see that. Chapter 30b, Pert Imheru, so-called Book of the Dead. The portion of the text reads, this chapter should be read by a person purified and cleansed who has not eaten animal flesh or fish. Let's look at the text itself. This is for the fools who said that we never had this, you know, understanding, and it comes from the Hindus. The Hindus didn't write the Runu Pertnim Heru. So it says, shall be recited this chapter by a person purified, Abu, and washed, one who has not eaten atu or mehit, animal flesh or fish. And then it tells the person what to do. Behold, you shall make a scarab, a kepra of green stone with its rim plated with gold and placed within the heart of the person. It will perform for him the opening of the mouth, anointed with an Juan and so forth. So it's talking about a ritual piece, but they're talking about one who is purified and washed, one who has not eaten animal flesh or fish. That's in the cosmology of ancient Khanid and Kemet. So, and then there were a couple other things, but we were just going into that to show that's been part of the culture, and it wasn't imported. And then a more recent study, ancient Egyptians had vegetarian diet, mummy study shows. Did the ancient Egyptians eat like us? If you're a vegetarian tucking in along the Nile thousands of years ago, would have felt just like home. It says, although previous sources found the ancient Egyptians to be pretty much vegetarians, until this new research, it wasn't possible to find out the relative amounts of the different foods they ate. A French research team figured out that by looking at the carbon atoms in mummies that had lived in Egypt between 3500 BC and 600 AD. So 4,100 years of mummies from different periods covering 4,000 years, 4,100 years. They looked at the carbon atoms and concluded that we were basically vegetarians. Not just a couple of mummies in a certain area that lived, at a certain time over the course of a few hundred years, mummies scattered over thousands of years from the first, dynastic period all the way through the late period into the time when the Europeans invade. So they go into detail about the carbon atoms and, the analysis and so forth, but that's what was going on. But that link is in that same article. Okay. Okay, so it says the stories like Oshun, the goddess of water in the Yoruba. Tefnut's story sounds like Oshun, the goddess of fresh water in the Yoruba. So there's a relationship with Tefnut and Oshun, which is Tefnut. Oshun is Heru in ancient Kemet, and you'll see that Heru also has the solar disk surmounted by a serpent and so forth. You'll also see a relationship if you look at the story of the Orisha, and you see a story of Ogun, going into the forest, and he took all his technology, and civilization was suffering because Ogun took his technology into the forest, his iron and so forth, because he broke away from, the larger community because he didn't like the way the people were operating out of harmony with order, and nobody could convince him to come back, into, the community. But then they sent Oshun, and she lured him with her sensuality, but she lured him out of the forest. But once again, it was the balanced complementary balance of male and female working together that persuaded the other, party to come back to civilization. That was bringing the male divinity back into civilization. In the story of the distant goddess and so forth, it is Shu bringing the female divinity back to civilization through, persuasion as opposed to ordering or commanding or force and so forth. Okay. So, and then it said a story of Shu and Tefnut, where was Ra at? So sometimes when they talk about the eye of Ra, you often see that the term the eye of Ra. Sometimes it's talking about the solar disk itself, but sometimes when they say the Ari Ra, they're talking about Ra'et. She has the title the eye of Ra, but then you also have like Tefnut is called the eye of Ra, Sekhmet is called the eye of Ra, and so forth, but they inherit that title from Ra'et. So sometimes when you're reading text and they say, well, Ra's eye did this, or the eye of Ra did this, and so forth, sometimes, depending on the nature of the text, it's talking about Ra'et. The term Ari or Ani, just like in Akan, Eni means I. In ancient Khanid and Kemet, Eni means I, but Eni or Ari also means to work, to make, or to do, and Arit means the one who works or makes or forms or creates. And Arit Ra being the eye of Ra, that's the title of Ra'et. She's the one that makes or forms what Ra gives, in the sense of the male, for example, releases the sperm cell and it leaves his body and enters the female and, fertilizes the egg, but then, and the fusion takes place. But then once that zygote, is manifest in the body of a female, then it's within her that she makes that into something. Ari, she fashions or forms or makes those divisions happen, that cell mitosis happen, that, cell division from 2 to 4 to 8, 16, and so forth, until multitudinous cells and so forth. But she's the Ari Ra, the one who makes or fashions or creates, the creatrix. The womb becomes the creatrix for Ra. So that's what the womb, the female does. The unfolding and, development of the embryo doesn't take place inside the male's body. That creation, the fusion takes place, place in the female body, but the unfolding takes place within the womb of the woman. So she's the creatrix in that capacity. So sometimes in the stories, when Rait is not mentioned by name, she's mentioned as the Ari Ra. But then sometimes in text, they may not mention Rait by name and so forth. But you know, just like, for example, if they're talking about the Ohini, the king, in our Khan tradition, they're talking about the, you know, what the Ohini had to say, or what declaration he made, or what decision he's made. The highest level council of the Ohini, the king, is the Ohema, the queen mother. So people know that if the Ohini, the king, made some declaration or some decision about what's going to go on in the nation, implicitly that means that it's been sanctioned by the Ohema, the queen mother, as well. So they don't have to necessarily, they don't always mention her in the same context. If there's an Ohema, the queen mother, they know that if there's an Ohini seated on the throne, they know that they're both there. So they don't always say the king or the queen, but we know. Just like when they mention Amen, Amen, they don't always mention Amenet or Ra or Rait and so forth. Depends on the context. But the people of ancient Khanate and Kemet, they knew all the different divinities. So it was no conflict, it was no mystery. In this context, in this culture, the whites and their offspring, who are Egyptologists, are looking around and uncovering texts and so forth, and they will focus on Ra, and they will focus on Amen, and they won't focus on Ra'et or Amenet or the other female divinities. And so therefore, since they don't do that, many of our people following along with them, they don't focus on them either, and they just talk about Amen created the world, or Ra created the world, and so forth, and they don't even look to see if Rait is there, because they're following along with the whites and their offspring. But our people who are living in the culture, they knew who the Abosom were. So it was no mystery whether they were mentioned or not. Okay. Okay, so that's the information we wanted to share on Shu and Tefnut. Because we did touch on them in the very first class when we were defining BAITI and the twin T Bai spirits. So we went into that cosmology about the, Shu and Tefnut being the, twin spirits within the dual Chafi. So we did some detail about that cosmology, but we just wanted to bring their physical earthly shrine to your awareness, the earthly shrine of Shu and Tefnut, which is in the upper mantle, that molten rock, as well as the ocean's worth of water that the whites and their offspring first discovered a few years ago. But as we showed in our book that we published years before that, we're talking about the upper mantle and so forth, and Shu connected to that. And then we did later broadcasts talking about Tefnut and so forth. Our cosmology has already laid that out. There are shrines within Earth, but then we show within the lung structure, the twin lung structure, the fiery, expansive, and contractive lungs within that water within the lungs, just like the water within the lower mantle and so forth, the hot springs that manifest and so forth, that fiery energy within the hot springs has the capacity to heal, to, the mineral water and so forth to heal. The warm water has the capacity to heal arthritis and these various things, but it can also scald and burn. How do we balance one another out? How do we utilize the energy of Shu and Tefnut, that expansive and contractive force that we utilize to build, establish nation building activities, sustain nation building activities, sustain ourselves physically? How do we utilize that energy to continue that process? But when there's conflict, how do we resolve conflict through that fiery medium? We follow the example of the divinities. We follow what Shu and Tefnut have done and how they have interacted with one another according to the cosmology. Okay. So you have a better understanding of who they are when you, Google Shu, Google Tefnut, read these different texts and so forth. Now you have a different eye for what's being spoken about. Okay, so that's the information we want to share on them. So this is the final class in BAITI-SENEB Part 1. Now we decided to do the Part 2 course. In that Part 2 course, we'll deal with Geb and Nut, with its earth, crust, and sky. Then Al-Sar and Al-Set, dealing with institution building and so forth, and that balance. Set and Nebuchadnezzar, also Main Ra and Tananet, And you'll see Ra and Rait as the male and female patron divinities of Oberima Afurakanu manhood, and that you'll see him in that book. And Obaatan Afurakanu womanhood, you'll see her in our book. We have the manhood book and womanhood book. You can download those for free. Those are the patron divinities and matron divinities of those books of manhood and womanhood and so forth. So Ra or Mentu and Tananet, also called Ra and Tananet, Hapi and Merit, as well as men and Heteru. So we're going to have those. So Gebet and Nut, Asar and Set, Set and Nebet Het, Mentu and Tananet, men and Heteru, Hapi and Merit. Those 6 sets of twin flame, marriages, divinities, and so forth. That is part 2 of BAITI-SENEB. That starts next week. Since you were in this class, you can take that class for $15. Just do the deposit option, and that pays for your entire class if you would like to take that class. Next week, if you know other people who would have been interested in this class, we're going to do part 1 again, starting next week for people who missed part 1 this session. So we're going to do part 1, BAITI-SENEB part 1 again next week. But then we're going to do part 2, brand new course, first time we're teaching that. And we're also doing, just so you can see this link, we're also doing a new class that we have not done before. We did some broadcasts on this, but we never did the class. So this is the first time we're doing this particular class. And because it's the first time, a number of people have joined in already. It's filling up. But this class is on the god Ma'at, the male deity of divine law, the counterpart of Ma'at. Most people never heard of Ma'at, don't even know he exists. He's one half of the divine law that undergirds all of creation. Without Ma'at, there is no Ma'at. Without Ma'at, there is no Ma'at. Without Ma'at, there is no creation at all. And they govern us. They exist in the various traditions. We prove that, who they are in Akan, who they are in Yoruba, who they are in the Ewe tradition, and so forth. You have a number of individuals pretending like the deity doesn't exist, because once we put this information out, we were the first to show who this deity is, show his image, and show his function in creation and how he shows up in the different traditions. You have individuals foolish enough to try to manufacture this idea that he doesn't exist and we just made him up because they never knew who he was. You have individuals who've been claiming to be experts on the culture of ancient Kemet, or priests or priestesses, eldresses, scholars. They've been misinforming people about Ma'at and never even heard of Ma'at for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, going back and forth to Kemet. If you've never heard these individuals mention Ma'at, but they talk about Ma'at all day, that's because they don't understand the cosmology. And because they don't understand that, then they don't understand much of the culture, period. If they miss this most essential divinity, then what else have they missed? And because they've been exposed for being intellectual frauds and cultural frauds because of our work, then some of them will try to pretend like we made the deity up because they don't want to admit to the fact that they don't know who the divinity is. And people are starting to question everything that they've ever taught because they didn't have this most basic understanding. So we're giving detailed information based on the broadcast and the books that we've published, plus additional information that we have not yet published that we'll be sharing in the class and so forth. So you can sign up for that. That's on the website and so forth. And that's what we're getting into. So Yedase for joining in once again. We also have our crowdfunding effort for our film festival. We're having our own film festival in October, the same weekend of the Hoodoo Mind Hoodoo Nation Festival. We're going to have our own annual film festival. The first one is in October. We're accepting submissions for films. It's the Conjure Film Festival. We found a theater yesterday. So we're going to go in next week and we're going to work on see what kind of contract we can get to secure that theater. But we put that information out in the email. If you'd like to support that crowdfund effort, the Conjure Film Festival crowdfund effort, we need to raise the funds for the deposit for the film, for the venue. And once we have that theater, it's a nice theater, state-of-the-art theater, so people's films can be shown on the big screen and so forth. And this helps with entrepreneurship for people who are filmmakers. They can educate our community with their films, empower our community with the films, youth as well as adults and so forth. It's also, it allows them to work. You know, they put their work out there, engaging in entrepreneurship, and then they also hire people who are actors and hire people who are also cinematographers and hire other people who are, you know, work on the sets with them when they're doing the filming and sound people. So just having a festival creates opportunities for entrepreneurship as well as employment for people who are filmmakers who can't get their films shown in other places. We're assisting with that. So that's economic empowerment for the community, but it's also education and empowerment when you see the films and it affects our people, youth as well as adults. So this is why we're having this film festival, to empower our people educational wise, cultural wise, spiritual wise, but also economic wise as well. So please support the, this is the film festival crowd fund. We'll put it in the chat room right quick. That is the piece. And then this, of course, is we just recently created this website, and that is the Conjure Film Festival website. When we talk about the film festival itself, we talk about the nature of the term conjure, and the films, all the films that we're going to be showcasing are films that, new films dealing with our ancestral religious traditions that we preserved in our blood circles. Hoodoo, which in North America, Hoodoo, the Akan tradition in North America, Juju, the Yoruba tradition in North America, Wanga, the Ovambo tradition in North America, Voodoo, the Eve tradition in North America, Grigri, which is the Mendi tradition in North America, and Gengan, which is the Fang tradition in North America, the Gullah and Geechee, which is the Gola and Kisi tradition in North America, and so forth. We preserved our ancestral religious traditions intact. So, and we haven't had, there's no film festival like this showcasing our ancestral religious traditions. We're dealing with ancestral religious reversion, returning to our ancestral religious practices, eradicating the foolishness of Christianity and Islam and Judaism, Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, all of that nonsense, and getting back to reality. So we're gonna have films based on that, whether they're dramatic or documentaries or action, whatever, you know, form it comes, but it's gonna educate and empower our people. So that's what's coming up, male and female filmmakers. So that's what we're working on. And for those who don't know, we were back in New York on Monday. Our film won the award for Best Original Documentary. We received that award on Monday. So, and we appreciate that. So that, you know, allows us to get more eyes on the work that we're doing, our first film, and then people can, you know, when they see that we have a film festival, they're more, you know, focused and saying, hey, this is the real deal. So, yes, and we're gonna have some information on BAITI-SENEB, our Ancestral Religious Reversion Conference, which is coming up in March, on the March 21st weekend. We're getting that together. That's our annual conference on ancestral religious reversion. BAITI-SENEB, and Akan Echi means back, and Sign means return. So BAITI-SENEB is to return back. It's ancestral religious reversion. We don't convert people to real, you can only convert somebody to something that they normally wouldn't engage in. We engage in reversion. We're returning to our original pristine ancestral religious practices. And this is our 5th annual BAITI-SENEB conference, where we have presenters dealing with the different ancestral religious practices that we've preserved in our blood circles. And we're getting that conference together. We're going to post some information on that in the next couple of days. Okay, and Yedase, we appreciate that comment in the chat room. So Yedase, thanks everybody, Yedase, for, you know, we have some people who have supported the crowdfund effort over the past couple of days. That's helping us out, because we're gonna have that meeting, as we said, to put down the deposit and get the venue, so we have to raise the funds for that. So we appreciate that. Please share that information as well. So we'll be sending out the final, you know, recording for this class in the next day or two. So again, Yedase, we thank you for joining this class. and Yebesha Bio. We will meet again. That's up.